So, Devin and I decided to go camping last summer. He found this old rustic campground online and it looked perfect for a quiet weekend away. I was a bit hesitant at first because it seemed really isolated, but Devin was so excited about it. He said it would be a great escape from our busy lives. When we got there, it was just as remote as it looked in the pictures. There were only a few campsites and most of them were empty. We saw one other camper, an older man with scraggly hair and a creepy vibe. He had this beat up old RV and kept to himself, which was fine by me. Devin said he was probably just there for the same reason we were, to get away from it all. We set up our tent, got a fire going, and started to relax. It was actually really nice at first. The air was crisp, the trees were tall, and the stars were bright. We made s'mores, told silly stories, and just enjoyed being together. But then things started to get weird. It was around midnight when we first heard it, a strange rustling noise coming from the woods. I brushed it off as animals, but Devin decided to check it out. He grabbed a flashlight and told me he'd be right back. I watched him disappear into the darkness, the beam of his flashlight bobbing up and down as he walked away. I waited and waited. 10 minutes passed, then 20. I called out his name, but there was no answer. My heart started pounding. Something didn't feel right. I grabbed my phone and tried to call him, but there was no signal out there. Panic set in, but I tried to stay calm. I thought maybe he just got lost or found something interesting. After what felt like forever, I decided to go look for him. I took the spare flashlight and followed the path he took. The woods were eerily silent, and the further I went, the more uneasy I felt. I kept calling his name, but there was no response. Then, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The flashlight beam landed on a clearing, and there was Devin's flashlight, lying on the ground, but no sign of Devin. I picked it up, my hand shaking. It was like he had just vanished. I looked around, desperately trying to find any sign of him, but there was nothing. I ran back to our campsite, hoping he had somehow returned, but the tent was empty. The fire had died down, and the night felt even colder. I didn't know what to do. Devin had the car keys, so I couldn't leave. I was trapped there, all alone. Then I remembered the creepy old camper. Maybe he had seen something. I walked over to his RV, my flashlight flickering. I knocked on the door, and after a few moments, it creaked open. The man stood there, his eyes narrowing as he looked at me.
"Can I help you?"
he asked in a gravelly voice. "Have you seen my boyfriend?" I stammered. "He went into the woods and hasn't come back." The man just stared at me for a moment, then slowly shook his head.
"Nope. Haven't seen anyone. You should probably stay close to your campsite. It's not safe out here at night."
I felt a chill run down my spine. There was something off about him, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I thanked him and quickly walked away back to our tent. I spent the rest of the night huddled inside, jumping at every sound. Sleep was impossible. I just sat there hoping that Devin would show up. When morning finally came, I decided to go back into the woods and search for Devin again. I didn't get far before I heard something behind me. I turned around, and there was the old man, standing at the edge of the trees, watching me.
"Need some help?"
he asked, but there was no kindness in his eyes. I shook my head and backed away. "No thank you, I'll manage." He nodded slowly and disappeared into the woods. I felt like I was being watched, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I couldn't stay there any longer. I had to find Devin or get help. I returned to our campsite and rummaged through our stuff, hoping to find a spare key or something. That's when I noticed Devin's backpack was missing. It didn't make any sense. He wouldn't have taken it with him just to check a noise. Desperation took over. I started walking down the road we came in on, hoping to find a signal or another camper who could help. But the road seemed to stretch on forever, and there was no one in sight. I felt like I was in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. After what felt like hours, I finally saw a car coming toward me. I waved it down, and the driver, a kind-looking woman, stopped. She let me use her phone to call for help. The police arrived a short while later and took me back to the campground to search for Devin. They found nothing. No sign of a struggle, no clues, nothing. It was like he had just disappeared into thin air. The creepy old camper was gone too, his RV nowhere to be found. Days turned into weeks and there was still no trace of Devin. The police investigation went cold and we were left with so many unanswered questions. To this day, I still don't know what happened to him or who that old man really was. But I do know one thing. I will never go camping again. I've always loved camping. There's something about being out in the wild, surrounded by nothing but trees and stars, that just feels right. So when my friends suggested we go on a camping trip for the long weekend, I was all in. There were 4 of us. Me, Mike, Jenny, and Lisa. We'd been friends since college and had been on countless trips together. We decided on a remote spot in the national forest that Mike had heard about. It was supposed to be beautiful and, most importantly, isolated. We packed our gear, loaded up Mike's old SUV, and hit the road early Friday morning. The drive was long but pleasant. We chatted, laughed, and enjoyed the scenic views as we left civilization behind. By the time we arrived, the sun was starting to dip below the horizon. The spot Mike found was perfect. There was a small clearing surrounded by thick forest and a clear, small stream nearby. We set up our tents, gathered some firewood, and got a campfire going. After a quick dinner of hot dogs and chips, we sat around the fire, sharing stories and enjoying the tranquility of the night. It was around 10:30 when we first heard it, a faint rustling in the bushes. At first, we brushed it off as just some animal, but then the noises became more deliberate, more like footsteps. Mike, being the bravest of us, grabbed a flashlight, turned it on, and pointed it towards the sound. We didn't see anything, but the uneasy feeling lingered. We decided to turn in for the night. Mike and I shared one tent while Jenny and Lisa shared the other. I had trouble sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I swore I could hear those footsteps again, closer this time. At one point, I thought I saw a shadow pass by our tent, but I convinced myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. The next morning, we woke up to find strange markings around our campsite. They looked like scratches, deep and purposeful, on the trees and on the ground. It was unsettling, but we tried to laugh it off. We spent the day hiking and exploring the area, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. That night, things got worse. As we sat around the campfire, we started hearing strange noises again. This time, it was a low, almost moaning sound, like someone trying to speak but failing. We were all on edge. Mike shined his flashlight around, but it was too dark to see anything beyond the immediate area. Then, out of nowhere, a rock came flying into our campsite, landing with a thud near the fire. We jumped up, hearts pounding, and looked around frantically. "Who's out there?" Mike shouted, but there was no response, just the eerie silence of the forest. We decided to stay up in shifts, keeping watch over the campsite. Mike took the first shift, then Jenny, then me. As I sat by the dying fire, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The forest was too quiet. No crickets, no owls, nothing. Just silence. Suddenly, I heard a twig snap behind me. I spun around, flashlight in hand, but saw nothing. My heart was racing, and I could feel the adrenaline pumping through my veins. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. Just as I was about to wake Mike for his shift, I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the clearing, tall, thin, and creepy. I froze, unable to move or speak. The figure took a step forward, and I could see the light reflecting on a knife in its hand. Panic surged through me. I scrambled to my feet, shouting to wake the others. Mike and Jenny were up in an instant, grabbing anything they could to use as a weapon. The figure took another step forward, the firelight casting an eerie glow on its face. It was a man, gaunt and crazy-eyed, with a horrifying grin that sent chills down my spine. "What do you want?" Mike yelled, wielding a large stick. The man didn't respond. He just stood there, grinning and staring at us. The tension was unbearable. Finally, he spoke, his voice raspy and unsettling.
"You're not supposed to be here,"
he said, taking another step closer.
"This is my place."
We backed up, fear gripping us. Lisa, who had been silent until now, finally spoke up. "We'll leave. We didn't know. We'll pack up and go right now." The man tilted his head, considering her words. Then, without warning, he lunged at us. Mike swung the stick, but the man dodged it effortlessly, slashing at Mike with his knife. Mike fell back, clutching his arm, blood seeping through his fingers. I freaked out and grabbed the large flashlight Mike had dropped and swung it at the crazed man's head. I hit him directly on the side of the head and he fell backwards. Panic erupted. We scattered, grabbing what we could and bolting for the car. The man chased us, his laughter echoing through the trees. We reached the car, threw our gear inside, and peeled out of there as fast as we could, hearts pounding and adrenaline coursing through our veins. As we sped down the dark, winding road, I looked back and saw the man standing in the middle of the road, watching us with that same twisted grin. We didn't stop driving until we reached the nearest town, where we found a small motel and huddled together in one room, too scared to sleep. The next morning, we reported the incident to the local authorities. They took our statement but didn't seem too surprised. Apparently, there had been reports of a deranged man living in those woods for years, scaring off anyone who dared to camp there. We never went back to that spot, and to this day, I can't shake the memory of that man's evil grin. Camping just isn't the same anymore. Now, every time I hear a rustle in the bushes or a twig snap, I get that same sinking feeling in my stomach, knowing that he's still out there. So, I've got to tell you about this one camping trip I went on a few years back. It was me, my buddy Jeff, and his girlfriend, Sarah. We were all pretty tight, having known each other since high school, and we thought it'd be fun to get away from everything for a weekend. Just us, nature, and no cell service. We headed out to the secluded spot in the woods that Jeff had heard about from a coworker. It was supposed to be perfect. No other campers, a nice lake nearby, and miles of forest to explore. We got there on a Thursday afternoon, set up our tents, and started a fire. Everything was great. We had some beers, cooked hamburgers, and just hung out under the stars. It was just one of those nights that felt perfect, you know? The next day, we decided to split up for a bit. Jeff wanted to do some fishing at the lake, and Sarah wanted to take some photos of the wildflowers and stuff. I was just into exploring, so I wandered off on my own. We planned to meet back at the camp around noon for lunch. When I got back to camp, Jeff was already there, but Sarah wasn't. At first, we weren't too worried. She liked to take her time with her photography, but as the hours passed and there was still no sign of her, we started to get anxious. Jeff and I decided to go look for her. We called out her name and searched the area around the camp, but there was no trace of her. It was starting to get dark, and that's when the real panic set in. We grabbed our flashlights and kept looking, but the woods felt different at night, more oppressive, like they were closing in on us. Then, out of nowhere, we heard a scream. It was faint, but unmistakably Sarah's. We ran towards the sound, crashing through the underbrush, our flashlights bouncing wildly. After what felt like forever, we came across an old, run-down cabin hidden deep in the woods. It looked like it had been abandoned for years, but there was a light on inside. We approached cautiously, and when we peeked through the window, we saw Sarah. She was tied to a chair, gagged and crying. My heart was pounding in my chest. We didn't see anyone else, so we decided to go in. The door creaked loudly as we pushed it open. The place reeked of mold and decay. We rushed to Sarah and started untying her when, suddenly, the door slammed shut. Standing there was this guy, tall, heavy-set, with a deranged look in his eyes. He had a knife, and he looked absolutely unhinged. Jeff and I tried to reason with him, but he just kept muttering to himself. Then, without warning, he lunged at Jeff. They struggled, and Jeff yelled for me to get Sarah out of there. I grabbed her hand, and we bolted for the door. As we ran, I heard Jeff scream. I wanted to go back, but Sarah was pulling me, begging me to keep going. We stumbled through the woods, half blind with fear, until we finally made it back to the camp. We collapsed, exhausted and terrified. I wanted to go back for Jeff, but I knew I couldn't leave Sarah alone. We huddled together until I could find the car keys, every sound in the forest making us jump. Once I was able to locate the car keys in Jeff's backpack, we made our way to the nearest town and called the cops. The cops flooded the area where we were camping, and they found Jeff. He didn't make it. The psycho had killed him. They caught the guy, though. Turned out he was a drifter with a history of mental illness. He'd been living in that cabin completely off the grid. I still can't believe it happened. It feels like a living nightmare I can't wake up from. Jeff was a great guy, a great friend, and he didn't deserve what happened to him. None of us did. Every time I think about that trip, I get this sick feeling in my stomach. We went out there for a good time, and we came back with scars that will never heal.